In episode 9, Maomao asked Jinshi for just one ridiculous favor.
もし私を処刑する場合、毒殺にしていただけませんか?
What a roundabout way to say, hey boss.
Hey, boss.
I'd rather die. But that question does two things. It exposes Maomao's biggest fear, but also explains how she stays frighteningly functional, even after the palace reminds her she was never safe. I'm Lucy, a certified coach with degrees in psychology and behavioral science, and yeah, we're dissecting Maomao again. Hey, you asked for this, okay? And I deliver. We're digging into this character. It's a shocking request, but what actually happened to Maomao that made her feel compelled to ask it in the first place? The answer to that isn't contained in episode 9. It's the accumulation of everything since episode 1. The episode begins with news that a high-ranking official has died after drinking. Maomao is then asked to answer a few desperate questions about it. Sir Conan, the victim, was an older official Jinshi knew well, and you can really feel the heaviness in the air. But unfortunately for Maomao, it doesn't stop there, because then someone finds another body, a completely unrelated case. It's the body of a servant from the rear palace, a member of the same group Maomao belonged to only a couple of months earlier. The anime's director and series composition writer, Nobuhiro Naganuma, stated that the episode was built around the themes of life and death, as well as differences in status. And you can feel it in everything around the episode. At first, the colored palette looks like the usual Apothecary Diaries, but when Maomao looks at the servant's body, everything is gray beneath thick clouds, and then it becomes red. Maomao surmises that this poor servant, clearly she was involved in something deeper. There are signs of a struggle. She wasn't strong enough to climb the palace wall by herself, meaning the official story was incomplete. And you can see that Maomao has had enough. It's as if she was slapped in the face. Because before episode 9, everything had been relatively smooth sailing for Maomao. She was starting to get just a little comfortable in the inner court. She had kind, trustworthy colleagues. Her boss was nice to a fault. And her other boss was a bit of a weirdo, but he was alright. But in episode 9, Maomao is reminded of just how little she is. Compared to the people she interacts with every day, she's just a little runt who should be grateful to have been placed in this position at all. Because apparently, someone from a background similar to hers can lose everything just like that. Even someone above her can. Well, that's basically what happens to Maomao in episode 9. And then she says it.
ジンシ様。
なんだ?
もし私を処刑する場合、毒殺にしていただけませんか?
It really looks like something called learned helplessness. It's basically what can happen after repeated exposure to suffering you cannot control. Eventually, effort drops. You stop looking for an escape even when an escape later becomes possible. But psychologically, I think Maomao's sentence says something much more interesting than learned helplessness. Because the clearest language of learned helplessness is reduced effort, passivity. And to be clear, being afraid of losing your life doesn't need some elaborate explanation. That fear is completely human. But in Maomao's question, there is conviction, sincerity, and that points us towards Maomao's biggest fear. The direction that we have right now is, it's not the death itself, but the powerlessness that leads to it. That's the direction. But I want to strip it bare, not only what that fear looks like in concrete terms, but also what it actually takes for a character to live through everything this dark world of the Apothecary Diaries throws at her and still remain functional. And also, can we leave those lazy answers behind? Like she's just not your typical protagonist. What does that even mean? Trauma made her stronger, as if we should be grateful for it. You know what's as tiny to your job to make you one? I don't care. So I think the right place to look is 1979. So the story begins with a name, Aaron Antonovsky, a medical sociologist who asks a question. Under relentless stress, what helps someone keeps moving toward health? Not just physically, but psychologically. The story of how Antonovsky arrived at this answer is genuinely fascinating. But since I want to keep the vibe of this video from being too Soul crushing? So basically he developed a framework called salutogenesis, and at the center of it is the concept that we're going to use today, sense of coherence. If I explain it in a really simple way, sense of coherence is basically an expectation. It's the expectation that life can remain comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful, even when it becomes painful and chaotic. There are 3 dimensions to it, and you will see how perfectly they describe Maomao, how she thinks, what she does, and the heavy questions she asks in episode 9. The first dimension is something called comprehensibility. And honestly, for this point, it's better to look at how Natsuhyuga, the author of the Apothecary Diaries, thinks about Maomao as a character instead of only looking at the anime. In the series, Maomao is depicted as this 17-year-old girl who is way wiser than her peers. She is extremely knowledgeable, but also much calmer and more action-oriented. And that actually has a lot to do with how the Apothecary Diaries was initially written. In multiple interviews, Natsuhyuga revealed how she first conceptualized Maomao. First of all, the protagonist was originally going to be some 35-year-old woman with 3 kids, so we were so close to getting MILF Maomao. But of course, the concept was scrapped because when the Apothecary Diaries was first published as a web novel on Soshatsu Kaninaro, a 35-year-old woman was a bit too different from the norm, so she changed the protagonist into a 17-year-old girl. But she also has admitted multiple times that some of that old lady toughness remained in Maomao. Hey, but real talk here. Honestly, that would have been kinda peak though. Look, I just want more adult cast, okay? In anime age, they tend to be fake anyway. Do you guys realize that this mother of one is like 20? I repeat, this is 19 or 20. And Mornie, this character I irresponsibly use as my avatar, is apparently around 35 to 40 years old. Oh yeah, and also I'm 6, how about... And also beyond that, Hyuga deliberately makes Momo see the world through a different lens. In the Apothecary Diaries, you have your optimistic, positive characters like Inghua, Gyokuyo. You still have those third-rate villains. You also have a more stoic character like Gao Shun, but no one thinks quite like Maomao. Then, if you have a character like Maomao who sees everything from above, that allows her to have a different perspective from other people. For Maomao, the world makes sense. Even when it's cruel, unreasonable, volatile, it is still legible. And you can see this in how Maomao acts before episode 9. In episode 5, when a eunuch comes to her and Guen, begging them to cure his curse, she simply walks over the drawers, grabs some salt, and demonstrates exactly why it is not a curse. When the emperor starts visiting Gyokyo more often after Li Hua loses her son, of course Maomao complains about it a little, but it's not like she doesn't understand why it's happening. Comprehensibility. It isn't simply about being smart. It's about how someone interprets incoming information. They expect that reality, even when it's chaotic, cruel, can be still made legible. Our brains are comprehension machines. They connect the dots whether we like it or not. Although there are cases when people just avoid the fact. It's like thinking Blue Lock's ego concept has values. Bro, what are you smoking? So that's one tool. She can see the bigger picture, which means that while she's suffering, she can at least understand why she's suffering. Of course that isn't enough, so the next dimension is this. Take a look at what Momo says before asking the question.
死んでしまえば、薬も毒も試せない。でも、もし自分が死ぬとするなら。
Ha! It's that topic again, folks. Meaningfulness. You know what? I'm genuinely curious how many people stopped watching at this exact part. Look, I know. Let's keep it short. Meaningfulness, it doesn't mean believing that everything happens for a reason. It means that at least something in your life still feels worthy of your energy and engagement. And for Maomao, medicine, poison, and the pursuit of knowledge repeatedly clear that threshold. And it's completely visible in her actions. The self-inflicted poisoning, the crazy smile. In the novel, when Momo was still working at the Frederick's house, she would sometimes appear with more than just a bandaged arm. Sometimes she looked extremely pale, and sometimes she fainted. People even slandered the woman because of it. So yeah, meaning. I can't say more about it, but it's very clearly there. But now, it gets pretty weird, isn't it? Why are we talking about meaning, about comprehensibility, when Momo knows damn well that the core conflict comes from something she cannot change? After multiple confrontations with death across episodes 6, 8, and 9, Maomao is forced to confront just how fickle her life really is. But of course, we can talk about Lakan, about how Maomao technically carries noble blood, but that isn't Maomao's identity in episode 9. Maomao was born in a brothel. She spent her childhood surrounded by courtesans. Without Lawman's teaching, she may have eventually become one herself, and then she was kidnapped and sold into the rear palace. Most of what happens to her was shaped by status, a status that competence alone cannot erase. So it sounds almost insulting that the third dimension of sense of coherence is called manageability. That's just cruel, bro. If Maomao states a burden she may have to carry throughout her entire life is the core problem, then what exactly is there to manage? Well, anything, not everything. Manageability means believing that when life places a demand in front of you, you still have some resources with which to answer it. Those resources can belong to you, or they can belong to people you can reasonably rely on. So now, Maomao actually has resources. She has Lawman's training, she has medical knowledge, sharp observation, ability to remain calm while everyone else is busy blaming a curse. She has Gyokuyo's trust, she has Jinshi. But of course, that doesn't make her safe. But the main point isn't making Maomao can control everything. And this is where Maomao's question comes in. So what happens in that question is Maomao is imagining a situation in which all of those resources have run out. Not even those bigwigs can clear her name, no medicine can save her. She knows that in this environment, even inside that room, her life is valued the least. She can't even control whether she dies, so at the very least, she wants to control how. So the poison request is not really manageability by itself, it is what happens at the edge of manageability, when Maomao protects the smallest piece of agency she believes might still be available. So looking at the learned helplessness we discussed earlier, Maomao's case is not learned helplessness. It's actually the opposite. It's an acknowledgement that her control is extremely limited, followed by an immediate search for whatever still remains. And this gives new color to almost everything Maomao does throughout the series. Most of the time, Maomao is basically being thrown around by Jinshi. But whenever she can, she takes ownership of what she does. She solves things in her own way. She makes them exciting. She puts some sauce into them because those actions are still hers. So, what does Maomao fear the most? Simple. It's becoming completely powerless over what happens to her own life and body. That is what the question exposed. But the fact that Maomao still asked the question exposed something else. She is going to move forward anyway.